there. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our biological scientist, Johanna Freeman, and she's going to talk to us today and tell us what makes a good habitat. Johanna, how are you?
Thanks, Carol. Okay, hi everyone. As Carol said, my name is Johanna Freeman, and today I'm going to talk to you about habitat. What exactly is habitat, and how do we determine whether or not we have a good habitat for a particular animal? In the first part of the presentation, I'm going to go over the scientific meaning of habitat, and in the second part, we'll go through an example of how the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission is working to improve habitat for an endangered species, the Flatwood Salamander. So the first question is, what is habitat? Very simply, habitat is a place where a plant or animal makes its home. Wild animals make their homes in ecosystems. Let's see which ecosystems these three animals make their homes in. We've got a freshwater stream, an Arctic tundra, and a desert. Polar bears live in the tundra, kangaroo rats live in the desert, and beavers live in freshwater streams. So we know which ecosystems these animals live in, but to really understand habitat, we're going to have to look a little closer. To do that, we're going to use a concept called the habitat triangle, and we'll start with the beaver as an example. The habitat triangle describes the three most important elements of an animal's habitat: food, water, and cover. What we mean by cover is safe places within a habitat for an animal to sleep, hide from predators, have babies, and so on. So let's do the habitat triangle for the beaver, which starts with a freshwater stream. What do beavers eat? They eat the bark of trees. How do they get water? Well, that one's easy for beavers. They always live near fresh water, so they can drink that. What about cover? Well, beavers build a huge nest called a lodge with a secret underwater entrance out of trees that they cut down with their teeth. So to break this down to its key points, beaver habitat equals a freshwater stream plus plenty of trees nearby. So if you just had a stream with no trees nearby, you wouldn't have beaver habitat, and vice versa. Let's do the habitat triangle for the polar bear. Polar bears primarily eat seals. They get their water by eating snow. And for cover, they make elaborate dens under the snow. So polar bear habitat equals snow plus seals. And then we'll do the habitat triangle for the kangaroo rat. Kangaroo rats eat seeds from grasses and other small plants. Because their bodies are adapted to desert life, they can live on very little water, and all the water they need is actually contained within the seeds they eat. And they make burrows in the sand for cover. So kangaroo rat habitat equals seeds plus sand. Now that we know how to analyze habitat, we can apply our skills to anything, such as Ewoks. Hopefully some of you are Star Wars fans and will follow this example. So Ewoks live in these beautiful old growth forests on the planet Endor. What do they eat? Humans. At least they did that one time. What do they drink? Well, these forests look pretty moist, so I'm guessing there are probably some nice ponds for them to drink from. And they live in these awesome tree houses. So Ewok habitat equals old growth forest plus human prey. Now let's move on to a real Florida example, the Flatwood Salamander. These little guys are in trouble for reasons that have to do with their habitats. So we're going to start by learning what makes good Flatwood Salamander habitat, why we don't have as much of it as we used to, and what we're doing to fix it. To understand salamander habitat, you have to understand their life cycle. Like frogs, salamanders are amphibians. They hatch out of eggs as swimming larvae similar to tadpoles, which get their oxygen from the water using gills. Those funny looking things around the larva's head are the gills. They slowly grow legs and then metamorphose into adults, which live on land and breathe air using lungs. Now, Flatwood salamander habitat is actually 3 different habitats, one for each life stage. They lay their eggs in the fall in dry, ephemeral wetlands, which are small pond-like areas that are wet for part of the year and dry for part of the year. The eggs are laid in areas with open sand and many small herbaceous plants. When the winter rains come, the eggs hatch and the larvae swim around in the temporary ponds. As adults, they live in a type of pine forest with moist sandy soil called a flatwoods, hence the name Flatwood Salamander. So let's do the habitat triangle for the larval stage. The swimming larvae mostly eat tiny aquatic invertebrates, these shrimp-like isopods and amphipods. Salamanders don't drink water like us, they absorb it through their skin, and the larvae are completely aquatic, so their water supply is taken care of. For cover, they hang out among these underwater plants called submerged aquatic vegetation. So, larval habitat equals flooded wetlands plus aquatic invertebrates. Now, for the adult flatwood salamanders, they eat a lot of earthworms along with spiders. They live underground in moist soil and absorb their water from the soil. And they make burrows in the sandy soil to live in. So adult flatwood salamander habitat equals wet sandy soils plus worms and spiders. Flatwood salamanders need our help right now. Why is that? Well, it has to do with their egg laying and larval habitats. You see, long ago, fires helped to create flatwood salamander habitats. Here's how. Over time, trees and shrubs start to grow in around wetlands. They grow and grow, drinking up water with their roots and crowding out other plants with their shade and litter. Eventually, they'll take over the wetland altogether. But if you live in Florida, you know that we have a lot of thunderstorms and a lot of lightning. When that happens in a forest, those lightning strikes can start fires. The fires burn away all that vegetation. Now, how can this be good? This doesn't look like a good habitat for anything. Well, it turns out that these little grasses and wildflowers tend to be much better at growing back from a fire than shrubs and trees. If you have repeated fires in and around these ephemeral wetlands, they'll maintain open areas that can fill with water during the wet season, and a lot of the little grasses and wildflowers salamanders need for egg laying and larval habitat. What went wrong? What happened was that humans started putting out the fires. People used to think that all forest fires were bad. They didn't realize that a lot of plants and animals depended on those fires to create and maintain their habitats. The problem got worse and worse. The wetlands disappeared and the salamanders with them. They're now in danger of extinction. What can we do? Well, what we do is called habitat restoration. We send in people with equipment to cut down excess trees and shrubs. And then we have wildland fire specialists carefully conduct prescribed fires to restore the pond and its surrounding vegetation. The plants and animals native to these ecosystems have adaptations that allow them to survive those low-intensity fires, such as burrowing underground. Once the ephemeral wetland is restored, we'll have all the elements of flatwood salamander habitat once again, and the salamanders can hopefully return to carry out their life cycles once again. Thank you for watching. Any questions?
We do have some questions. Thank you so much, Johanna, for explaining habitat to us and what makes a good habitat. Wanted to know, you'd mentioned old growth forest. Can you please explain to us what old growth forest is?
Yeah, so an old growth forest is one that has never been logged, the canopy has never been cut down, and also importantly for things like salamanders, it's also a forest where the ground layer vegetation has not been disturbed, because if a lot of disturbance happens to soil and plants, often you get weeds back in their place and you don't get the same habitat back.
So in old growth forests, we don't do prescribed fires?
In Florida, old growth forests are fire maintained forests, that both the trees and the understory plants have adaptations that not only allow them to survive fire, but thrive from fires.
How often should forests, how often should prescribed fires occur?
It depends on the ecosystem and the type of forest, but scientists have done a lot of work trying to answer that exact question. And part of it is by consulting historical data. And part of the research that we've done is looking at the responses of plants and animals to prescribed fires. So we go out there and collect data before the fire, and then we go out and collect data after the fire and see what happens to the plants and animals. And for the forests in question, flatwoods, we think that a fire interval between 1 and 5 years, so fires reoccurring once every 1 to 5 years, are necessary to maintain that ecosystem. And the average would be about 3 years. Okay.
Good. You mentioned that salamanders, species like salamanders, survive the fires because they live underground, so they can burrow underground. What happens to animals that don't live underground when we have the fires? Are we concerned about them not surviving?
So it would depend on the animal, and obviously the more mobile an animal is, the more easily it's going to be able to get away from a fire. So for the most part, birds would be able to fly away. Larger animals could run away. There are a lot of burrowing animals in these ecosystems, and that is probably an adaptation to surviving fire. But it is the case that in some cases, a single fire probably could harm some plants and animals that are living there at that time. However, their overall populations will be helped by the fire, because they'll continue surviving in adjoining areas and then come back in. Those are called refugia, and come back in and repopulate the area. If there was no fire at all, those organisms would actually not be able to survive there. So the fire, it's a good thing for the species overall, even if it causes some temporary harm to a few things that are living there.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between, we've been hearing about the wildfires that are out in California and causing a lot of damage. And we just talked about how we want to do prescribed fires that are beneficial. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between wildfires and prescribed fires in terms of their benefits or not?
Yeah, so when we get really bad wildfires like we're seeing in California, there are a couple reasons for that. One is partly because of fire suppression. We think, similar to what happened in the Flatwood Salamander habitat, people put out fires for a long time, and so a lot of woody fuels built up, a lot of trees, a lot of shrubs. Something else that's happening is climate change causing longer and stronger and more frequent droughts, which really, really dries out that fuel. So you have the conditions out west to contribute to really bad wildfires. And something else is the human populations have expanded so that they're living at what we call the wildland-urban interface. And people have houses right up against these very fire-suppressed woody areas that can catch on fire easily. In Florida, we've been doing a lot of prescribed fire all the way back into the 1990s. And what happens when you do it a lot is that you get rid of a lot of that woody buildup of shrubs and trees. And when you light a fire, it just moves right through a grassy understory. It's low intensity, it's not that hot. The flame lengths don't go that high. And we have teams of people surrounding it to be able to put out any little spot overs. That's like a spark that would go outside of the controlled burn area. So because we've been working on it for so long and burning so well, and we have systems down to do these prescribed fires, they are very safe and very well controlled, and they actually help prevent bad wildfires because we keep the woody buildup away, and we just have these what we call fine fuels, light grasses and things that burn quickly and with low intensity.
Nice. We have quite a few questions about the salamanders. I just want to remind everyone that Johanna is a botanist and not a herpetologist, so reptiles aren't her specialty or her study. She's looking at the habitat, the plants, the environment. So one person asked, do we have these salamanders in Pinellas County? So I don't know could you maybe talk about the type of habitat that would salamanders maybe be found in Pinellas County or not because of the type of habitat we have here?
I can take this one.
Okay, thanks. This is Kent Williams, everyone.
Hello. No, there are no flatwood salamanders in Pinellas County. In fact, there's actually two species of flatwood salamander. There's the frosted and the reticulated. They look almost identical. There's no way to tell them apart. And they are only recently, like around 2008, 2009, that we figured out that they were actually two different species. Historically, and they're divided by the Apalachicola River. So they occur mostly in the Panhandle. The reticulated salamander occurs west of the I'm getting my rivers mixed up, Apalachicola River. The frosted occurs east, and they're pretty much restricted to the Panhandle and northern Florida. And they, at least with the frosted salamander, they historically their range used to occur up in Georgia, all the way up into South Carolina, but I don't believe they ever occurred south of Alachua County historically.
Okay.
So these salamanders are in very bad shape. For example, up in Georgia, there was a recent survey done where they went back and dip netted in 92 wetlands that were historically known to have salamanders in them. And they found only 12 out of those 92 wetlands, only 12 still had the salamander in them. So yeah, it's quite shocking how fast they've declined. And unfortunately, you know, these types of species that tend to get into trouble have very specific habitat requirements, such as what Johanna just presented. So that's why they tend to get into trouble.
And Johanna, can you tell us, you mentioned ephemeral wetlands, and we mentioned, you said flatwoods, we talked about old growth forests. Can you talk about all of the different habitats that are in Florida? Because we have such a range diverse in our state. Is there kind of a list that you can give us?
That would be overall a very long list, but of the stuff. But I can talk a little bit more about, you know, the flatwoods and wetlands. Flatwoods are actually a type of savanna. Savanna is an ecosystem that has widely spaced trees and a lot of grasses and wildflowers in the understory. So most people are familiar with the African savanna. It's basically a grassland with scattered trees. We have savannas too. Ours are pine savannas with longleaf pine trees that are spaced far apart. They're adapted to fire, and then a grassy understory. So that is an old growth. If the trees haven't been cut down and the understory plants are intact, that's an old growth savanna. If there's no fire, eventually you would get other tree species that came in and grew to maturity, and in a couple hundred years, you would have what we call a hardwood hammock. That would be an oak canopied forest with a closed canopy. They're typically very dark. They do not catch on fire easily. They have a lot less biodiversity in the understory. Savannas tend to have a lot of diversity of plants and animals because they're allowing in so much light, and also the fires keep competition down, so it allows a lot of little plants and animals to coexist out there.
Good, thank you. Someone asks if a habitat is healed, so I'm thinking that they're thinking, you know, after prescribed fire and kind of restoring, the animals in that habitat, could they move to a different habitat?
So if it's, you know, if we restore a habitat successfully, then yeah, if you did enough of it and you got the animals back, then conceivably they could become, that could help the overall population recover, and then they would start moving from there to other areas.
What happens if the habitat is restored but the salamander doesn't return?
So our agency does active efforts to bring flatwood salamanders back also. It's called Head Starting, and we are raising them in captivity and then releasing them into the wild once a habitat is restored.
What's your favorite part about your job?
I really like finding out things about the natural world, especially when they help us help the plants and animals in it. So my job as a scientist is to go out and measure things and count things and collect data about the natural world. Then we go back and analyze it and try to figure out what's going on. And I find that whole process to be a lot of fun.
Well, thank you very much, Johanna. Thank you, Kent, as well, and our habitats, and certainly the Flatwood Salamander thanks you for all the work that you do. Attendees, thank you for tuning in. And if you didn't get a chance, we had 27 presentations today. We will have all of these presentations posted on our website, which is myfwc.com/MarineQuest. And we will post answers to the questions. So again, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Johanna. Thank you, Kent. And thanks for all the great work you're doing.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.